Hey, this is Amanda back with another Fairy Stamper Design Team project, and today we're going to be doing an Emboss Resist with shimmer powders. So I'm starting off with the Forest Flowers and some Fabbriano hot press watercolor paper. If you're not familiar, hot press watercolor paper is smooth versus cold press water paper, which has a texture. And I prefer to use hot press water paper if I'm going to be doing a lot of stamping, which I'll be doing today. So like I said, I'm starting off with these forest flowers. There's 4 different flowers or plants, whatever you want to call them, in this stamp set. And I'm using all 4 of them at once, and I'm stamping them with VersaMark ink, which is a clear sticky ink. Since this is the first time I'm using this stamp set, I did decide to stamp them twice to make sure that I got good coverage with that VersaMark. So I'm using Nuvo embossing powder here, and this is Purple Haze. And as you can see, it is a nice bright purple. And I'm going to use those same flowers, and I mixed them up a little bit here so they're not in the same order. And I'm going to be using Distress Oxide this time in Saltwater Taffy. Now, because I don't have very many colors of embossing powder, I have a lot of embossing powder, but I don't have very many colored ones. I've got metallics and that kind of stuff, but not very many colors. So in order to make this distress or resist technique a little bit more interesting, I decided to get out some of my Distress Oxides, and I'm going to cover them with clear embossing powder. This is great to do if you don't have a lot of colors. Just get out some pigment inks. They can be any pigment inks. They don't have to be Distress Oxides. But because oxides have that pigment ink property, they work great for this. So I decided to try out my new Saltwater Taffy, and I'm just going to sprinkle some clear embossing powder over this and heat set it off screen. So now I decided to take one of these floral images from the thank you set, and the thank you set has quite a few different florals and bits and bobs in it. And I'm just taking one of the images here. I'm going to stamp it off the card front edge here to give it a little bit more interest, and we're going to use Salvage Patina this time. Now my basement, or my craft room, is in the basement. It is still rather chilly here where I'm at. So I have the pellet stove on. I also run a dehumidifier in my craft room because, like I said, I'm in a basement. It tends to be a little wet down here sometimes. Well, not actually wet, but it's damp. So having those 2 things running causes my inks to dry rather quickly sometimes. So I'm just going to stamp one of these images at a time and put the embossing powder on so they don't dry out before I get a chance to put the embossing powder over it. I was able to do the other ones all at once, stamp all 4 images at once and put the embossing powder down. If you do not have a pellet stove running and a dehumidifier running, you could probably get several images stamped in a row, or stamp 2 or 3 of them at a time before you put the embossing powder on. So I did stamp, I believe, 3 of these. I'm only showing 2 on screen. And then I'm going to move on to doing some white heat embossing, but I did not show that on screen because, well, you can't see it. You can't see me stamping in the VersaMark. You can't see me putting the white embossing powder on. So I just cut that completely out of the video because it really wouldn't be interesting footage for you. So now I am going to move on here to putting on some Lindy's magical powders and some Nuvo shimmer powders. I'm popping up the colors on the screen here, but I did use some glittering gold for the Lindy's and some Oom Pah Pah Pink. And then in the Nuvo shimmer powders, I used Lilac Waterfall and Blue Blitz. For this first layer here, I did do 3 layers. And for the second and third layers, I left out the glittering gold because, as you can see here, I did get a few little muddy bits there in the flowers. That is from the gold, which is kind of a yellow color, and the purple mixing together, which makes mud. I didn't really think that one through thoroughly. So I did decide I kind of wanted a drippy, kind of ethereal look here. I did kind of change gears towards the second and third layer. I decided I didn't really like the drippy look. So, you know, sometimes you change your mind and don't like things. So perfectly acceptable to do. I'm dabbing some of this up, and then I'm going to heat set it with my heat tool. You will need to be somewhat careful with this because you don't want to overheat those embossing powders and burn them or cause them to sink into the paper. So I'm just going to add some more of these shimmer powders. Again, I did not use that glittering gold. Yes, glittering gold in the second and third layer because I didn't want to make more mud. So I'm just going to add some more of these. I'm going to try and be a little bit more generous this time because I decided that this was way too light here. These are some rather light colors, more pastels, except for that blue there, which as you can see just explodes when I add water to it. But I did want a little bit more vibrant than I got in that first layer. And obviously some of it dried back, and I did dab some of it up with my towel, so that's part of why it was really light there too. Again, I'm going to drip that down, but like I said, this is about the time I'm like, not so sure I like the drippy look. So I'm going to wipe up some of the excess here. And then I think this is about the time that I grab a paintbrush and like get rid of some of those harsh strips there. And I'm still thinking at this point, this is way too light. I like bold colors. If you have been following me for any length of time, you know I like bold color. So we are going to add some more. And I don't believe that I dried it this time. So I'm just going to add it wet, which is perfectly acceptable to do with these shimmer powders. You can add them wet or you can wet them afterwards. It doesn't really matter. I do notice that if you add them wet, you're going to get more of a speckly look, which is usually why I add them to dry paper. But I kind of liked the speckle look here. It kind of made it more fantasy-like. And you will see in the pictures of my finished card, I actually added Posca pens, kind of dotted them all over in the various colors that I used in this card, and kind of gave it more of that kind of like glowing orb feel, or maybe you can consider them fireflies or some kind of something like that, just to kind of give it more of a fantasy type feel. So I'm going to just get the excess that's pooling up here on the edges, and then I'm going to heat set this. Moving on to some more stamping, I'm going to take those same stamps again, the forest flowers and some of them from the thank you set as well. And I'm going to stamp this in some, I believe I started off with the purple, which is the almost amethyst from Stampin' Up. I don't have a ton of stamping inks in colors, so I'm just using some old Stampin' Up pads that I have, and we're just going to stamp these. Doing this in the dye ink because the embossing powder is more vibrant and more towards the front. Doing this in the dye ink kind of pushes those back in the background, and we're just adding more layers to our stamping. So this one is the Pretty in Pink. Again, I did pick lighter colors too, kind of making that push more towards the back as well. So just doing a couple of these, and then we are going to go to our focal image, and this is the Bluebells stamp from Fairy Hugs. And I'm going to be stamping this in the VersaFine Nocturne. And because we are stamping over some embossing, this isn't going to be a perfect image, but that's okay, we can fix it. So I did stamp this a couple times to try to get this as clear as possible. But there were a few places that over that white embossing powder that I did have to fill it in, and I just chose to do that with a fine tip Sharpie, but you can fill that in with whatever you wish to use. So it's not going to be perfect. If you planned this out better than I did, you could probably kind of choose where to put that. It seemed like the white heat embossing was the biggest problem. So if you kind of planned that out a little bit better than I did, you could probably kind of make sure you don't put the white embossing powder where you're going to put your focal image. So now I'm adding Fifi on top of the flower so it looks like she's sitting there. And Fifi does come with two little images. One is her blowing bubbles with a little wand, and the other one has like little dandelion seed heads where she's blowing those. So on the inside I put the dandelion seed heads, and on the outside I put the bubble wand. I did choose to leave this card without a sentiment, and off screen I did color in her wings, put some little Posca pen dots, and just did some little detail things to my card. In the description box there will be links to all the supplies that I used, as well as social media links to me and to Fairy Stamper. And as always, have a great day.